on her book, A Hindu in Oxford. I'm Dr. Rachna Singh, and for those who've not read the book, just let me give a little context here. A Hindu in Oxford is an experiential book where Rashmi talks about her experiences as a student in Oxford. And it also talks about some larger issues like discrimination and the colonial narrative in place in academic circles. But I think we'll let Rashmi do the talking here. So a very warm welcome, Rashmi. We have a full house for your session. So I think without further ado, let's just dive into the conversation, shall we?
We shall. And Namaskara Bengaluru. As a Kannadati, it is, I think it's immensely, it's a great pleasure to have such a great festival happen right here in my home state.
So Rashmi, let me start the conversation by taking you back to the starting point of your journey. For a lot of us, Oxford is the mecca of higher education, and a lot of us would aspire to sort of enter its hallowed portals. So tell us what made you apply for a master's degree in Oxford, in energy systems, I believe, after doing your BTech in mechanical engineering?
Well, when I was very little, I was gifted an Oxford thesaurus because I was a voracious reader as a child. And I asked my father, what's Oxford? What's this Oxford dictionary? My father told me that there's a #1 university in the world by the name of Oxford in a town called Oxford. And it was a childish obsession that whatever you do, you need to do the best to the best of your abilities. And I think over a period of time, it was that childish obsession coupled with the sort of rigor that academic work brought in that ultimately took me there. So it's definitely the sort of aura that Oxford has as the, I'd like to say, the Ram Janmabhoomi of education that drew me to Oxford in the very first place.
Right. So Rashmi, in your book, you talk about how when you first reached Oxford, you were absolutely euphoric and you loved everything, you embraced everything. But after a while, you felt that the shine had sort of worn off for you, And you talk about how you felt that Oxford was built on, sort of money contributed by colonizers. You take two names specifically. You talk about Rhodes and you talk about Codrington, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So tell us what made you arrive at this kind of a conclusion that it was based on blood money. That is the term you've used in your book, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When I was at Oxford, I took this very notorious tour called the Uncomfortable Oxford Tour. And that would sort of point you towards the mischievous corners of the campus. And that's when I started to understand the sort of heavy colonial past that's there. And it went beyond the colonialism as I knew it from my history books. I saw colonial masters such as Christopher Codrington, Cecil Rhodes, still being celebrated. There's statues in every corner. And that is not something that you're used to in India. People who have done horrible things, they've been sidelined, they're not celebrated, and least of all, there are scholarships that go by their names. So I was very surprised, why is there still a very prestigious scholarship that goes by the name of a man who did horrible things to indigenous people? People who are ancestors of many people who, today study at that university. And it wasn't like there was a lack of money. Alumni were sort of lining up and milling up to contribute money and set up scholarships in their names. But somehow there was this sort of, there was some sort of inertia to take that money and to retain that old money. Eventually, I also realized that a lot of the studies which were happening in the various departments there were whitewashing the colonial crimes. And that's when I think the scales kind of tipped for me. There was one particular study which attributed the sufferings of the cause of the Bengal famine to the Hindu Mahasabha and not to the sort of discriminatory policies that Winston Churchill brought in. And that's when I had it. I was completely, flabbergasted. Being a science student who did engineering and who was this geek who cared about math and, physics and chemistry, it was a life-altering moment for me to realize that this is what happens, and and it's fully funded. These positions which push a certain kind of narrative. End of the day, I realized that it disadvantages our people in the kind of the global market space that these narratives then set up. Narratives are not just stories. Colonial stories today are not just a point of ego match where you say that my ancestors were better than yours, but today's marketplaces are based on the very narratives which run on your people, which show the kind of people you were. And if these narratives set your people up as, I remember the question that came to me when I ran for president was, Rashmi, why do you push for decolonization? Colonization was a positive experience for your people. It taught them how to clothe, it taught them how to eat properly like humans, and it taught them how to speak like humans. So that was it for me. So it was, I think, a series of these experiences. And you need to be there, you need to see it to believe it, right?
Yeah.
So it was one of those moments which burst the bubble open for me, and I could sort of see the darker side to the sort of glorified narrative which is pushed about Oxford around the world.
Right, right. So, okay, now Rashmi, shifting gears a little bit, instead of talking about Rashmi, the activist who sort of fights all malpractices, let's talk a little about Rashmi, the person. So when I was reading your book, I realized that you've been canvassing for and winning a lot of leadership positions. I think you were the divisional representative in a body, and then I think you became the woman representative in another body, co-founder for the Aviation Society, and of course, you were the president of the Oxford Student Union, and with a whopping 54% margin, right? So tell us, I'm curious to know, what motivated you to run for these positions? One, and the second question that I would like to tack on is that in a place like Oxford, which would be a very competitive environment in terms of leadership positions, how did you manage to succeed? What were the key skills or strategies that you used to succeed and get into these positions?
Well, I think one of the reasons, and I think one of the major motivations I had to run for these positions was the fact that I had nothing to lose. Very often in such places, you have legacy children, children whose parents are prime ministers, they come from royalty, and they're constantly scared of losing. And here I was this one girl nobody knew at Oxford who had come from fresh out of Udupi. I'd lived in Udupi, a very small town here in Karnataka, all my life. And I think when you don't care what people think about you, especially the sense of confidence that anonymity can give you, is something that I deeply experienced, and I think that gave me the sort of reckless optimism. In fact, when I ran for many of these positions, very often, few of my friends would come up to me and say that, why are you running? You're only going to get one vote, the vote you give yourself. So I think I wasn't too embarrassed because not too many people knew me, and I didn't have a long line or liege to attach as to who I was. So that sort of brought in the reckless optimism aspect into running for these positions and doing things. And I think this is something that I had a little bit of practice with as well, because I went to a very unnoteworthy sort of establishment for my earlier education, not one of the fancy schools in any tier 1 city, very small town school. But as a fundamental person, I do believe that I used to get moved by injustice a lot. When I was in kindergarten, I remember there was this child who would always bully another child and take away her lunch. And I would be that person who would actually stand up and, put myself on the line and fight. And for as long as I can remember, I have fought for positions like class leader. I still remember, I think it was kindergarten. And those days you didn't have elections. In kindergarten, all the class teacher asks is, who wants to be class leader?
Yeah.
And half the children can't understand. The other half are just, lost talking to their neighbor. So I had the sense to put my hand up. And I think by virtue of being the only contender for the position, I got my first leadership position.
Yeah.
And I think validation does increasingly encourage you to seek more such positions. And I think it was that. And
So maybe it was be the change you want to see in the world kind of approach also that made you
Absolutely.
jump into these, canvassing for such
canvassing
positions.
for such positions.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Rachna ji, you used the word, I think, activist. I do believe that activism is necessary, but I think change can only happen if you're part of the system.
Right.
From outside, you can create ripple. You can create a ripple. You can create a conversation, a debate, start a debate. But unless you're part of the system, it's difficult,
difficult to fight the system.
fight
yeah.
the system and sort of bring the change.
Yeah.
And it is the more difficult path is to create the mandate, get the position in the first place. But I think the change that you do bring by putting in the hard work of bringing the mandate in the first place is long lasting. And it is something that, generations to come can appreciate. Colonialism was something I could have just gone out on the streets of, and there was a huge sort of cancelling Cecil Rhodes sort of a movement that happened, which wanted to. It was a very radical movement. That was one
because
way.
in your manifesto you talk about how you wanted all those statues removed from
Yes,
the premises.
the premises.
And, yeah.
And the key part of my manifesto was to actually create a consultation to change the syllabus at the University of Oxford.
Yes, the
So
curriculum.
I believe that would not just sort of bring in change in the short term.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be short term anger manifesting in a way or two, but it would also create an environment where such things are discussed, keeping in mind the collective experiences of all kinds of people, and not just the people who are descendants of the erstwhile colonizers. And it's trickle down effect. The same textbooks will then be emulated in every other university, including universities here in India. So that was the sort of long-term goal, symbolism along with long-term policy changes.
Right. Incredible, yeah. So, Rashmi, in your book, you talk about how your, election happened, how you became the first woman president of the student union, and overnight you became the target of a lot of hate mail, and you were trolled mercilessly on social media, so much so that you finally resigned and you had to leave. So, I'm curious to know, is it your stand on colonial narrative that was in place that sort of triggered this kind of a negative response to your election, or was it something else?
Well, in my book, I also discuss about the kind of hate mail I got before my election. And it had all sorts of things to do. These slurs are actually, with a certain degree of asterisks reproduced in the book.
Yeah.
They went after my skin color. They went after where I came from. And I have a reason to believe that it was a continuation of that. But, I mean, it's not fashionable anymore in these intellectual circles to just call out a person because you don't like where they come from. And very often, social justice tends to get weaponized in a way to then carry out the same effect of, cancelling actual people who are trying to bring in change, actual people who've gone through racism, who've experienced it, who've experienced othering. And then it just ends up becoming a weapon. So I believe that I experienced that, and to the extent of, stacking up all of the sort of messages and the sort of public posts which went up against me, and I've put it in the chronology of the timeline in which they happened. So if anybody tries to put the two together, it definitely draws up the conclusion that it had a lot to do with who I was and what I stood for. But the way that they went after me was crafted to be extremely fitting for the times.
Yeah, and especially because you talk about this history professor you've mentioned, who happened to be an Indian gentleman. So which was a little surprising because, I mean, you would expect, an Indian to support you in your canvassing and, getting to a leadership position. And in fact, you say that that was the tipping point, that sort of moved things, and made you feel physically ill. You talk about sleep trauma that you suffered. And then you resigned and you flew back to India. So I'm sure you would have, had to go through a terribly emotionally taxing time, but you got your act together and you emerged stronger and you went back to Oxford with your head held high. So tell us more about how you got your act together, because I mean, that was a very tough situation you found yourself in. So tell us about that. We're more interested in knowing about how you managed to emerge stronger. Yeah.
So, yes, I mean, all of the experiences and all of what was happening to me, from receiving a daily sort of set of death threats to being cancelled to the extent of, I would find myself in the supermarket and people would move away from the aisle I would be standing at, and it was not social distancing, let me be clear. So that was the sort of social boycott that I was going through, and to a young mind, especially a young mind that's in university that thrives on social validation, acceptance, um, it was extremely traumatizing. Traumatizing to the point that I had sleep paralysis. My address was doxed. I mean, I had absolute no sense of safety that I would wake up fit and fine the next day. It was traumatizing. I had sleep paralysis and I hit rock bottom. But I think since I've lived to tell the tale, I've lived the whole adage that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And these experiences, end of the day, do teach you more than, I think, positive affirmations or stories can. Actually, living through these episodes do help you out. But I did have support. I had support of Indian people in India and a lot of people within society, not just in Britain but across the world, who had gone through similar experiences of being cancelled and pushed to the corner for no fault of theirs. And I think, being at the bottom somewhere, I started building up that resilience. I also became extremely spiritual during that time. Growing up, I had this whole phase where I was an atheist. I had completely rejected religion, and I was on center left, from far left to center left, a spectrum where I'd completely discounted religion and spirituality. I rediscovered a huge aspect of that as well, and I think today I would say that it was that actually saved me, my, sort of rooting in who I was and what I was. And going back to Udupi for that 1.5 month made a whole lot of difference. It reminded me who I was,
Right.
and it taught me that end of the day, it is the impact that you create which matters. And if you're okay with it, it doesn't matter the kind of validation that you get from your peers. It might be out of fashion to think a certain way at a particular time because the entire dispensation might think so. But you need to stick to what you think is fundamentally right, because there will come a time when what you thought will be fashionable. So,
Right.
and right. So I think it got down to that whole point. It was a very um, deep period for me. I think I aged quite a bit during those months. And I went back, and let me tell you, when I went back, I think my attitude dictated how everybody treated me. I went back with my head held high, and I was suddenly back in almost every other circle. The same circle that had cancelled me, had welcomed me. I was even more popular than I was before being president, before being elected president. And my sort of lunches that I threw in my backyard with I had this regular lunch that I would throw with Indian food. It had more people than I could feed.
Right.
So I think your attitude, end of the day, also dictates how a crowd treats you. And barking dogs seldom bite.
Right. So another thing, Rashmi. Now, obviously, you've talked at length about the discrimination you faced. We are talking about a venerated academic institution here. We're talking about Oxford. So tell us, how can these universities, better address the biases that the international student community faces? Because we have a huge international student community coming there, not just from India, from all over the world, and they come from diverse backgrounds. So what, in your opinion, should be the change that should be brought about by these academic institutions?
I think at this point of time, if you walk into a university like Oxford or Cambridge, you will find terms like Diversity Week, Multicultural Week, and you will find very often that the websites or the brochures or any of the material which is discussed often has people of color on the brochure as a point of symbolism. But the unfortunate part is that it doesn't advance beyond symbolism. It is just restricted to having a week where you eat food from across the world and you have people from across the bench come in and give a speech or two about these topics, and that's where the buck stops. There is no deeper analysis as to what academically these institutions are propagating. Fundamentally, they're still colonial. No matter how much they try to, portray themselves as, accepting and decolonized, the minute you still have a scholarship named after a former, colonial master, the minute you still have, research topics which are advancing the same line, you're fundamentally that. You've just changed the facade to be politically relevant and politically correct with the times that you're in. So I think there needs to be fundamental change within the way the functioning happens, the way that these institutions tackle things. And I do hope that change will come, and that change will be beyond symbolism, beyond just a few acts of trying to portray a more inclusive environment. I think the necessity is to be true inclusivity to sort of exist on campus beyond the sort of
Yeah. So let me shift gears a little bit now, and let's talk about the actual writing of your book, Because when you write an experiential book like the one you've written, obviously you have to revisit traumatic periods of your life. So, and also the fact is that the book will appeal to people only if it doesn't seem like an emotional outburst. It has to be able to appeal to their logic and to their reason. So tell us, how did you achieve that sense of, detachment and objectivity which is needed to, write about such traumatic personal experiences?
Well, I think it came from the fact that nobody wanted to believe my story. So my story had to be one which was detached from itself, which was objective, because disbelief was the first response I got from across the board, from media outlets, from my own peers, from society at large. So I think that sense of detachment and that sense of othering that I found in popular culture is what pushed me to have that sense of detachment. Writing for me didn't start as a literary journey as it does to many people who are encouraged to write because they have a passion for writing. It started more of as a cathartic experience,
Yeah.
to sort of in a way to get over the trauma of having lived through what I did. And every morning I would wake up with a blank mind, and the only way that I could go about the day would be to sort of note down what I'm going to do through the day, and at night sort of take stock of what happened against the same. And that also became a sort of template. It's written in a form, it's written like a journal of those years.
Yeah.
So journaling in a way sort of pushed me through those days, and I
Right.
think that then came into a book. But the disbelief that I faced helped me achieve that objectivity, is what I'd like to believe.
So now there must be a sense of closure, if not peace at least. So what next for you? Do you see yourself continuing to advocate for diversity, inclusion on a larger platform?
Absolutely. I think decolonization is much deeper, and decolonization happens on many levels. And a country like Bharat, you have a multi-layered sort of a society where you see colonial aspects in your everyday life. I feel like now that I've been through the churn, it's something I can see everywhere in my own society as well, in the way that we go about, in the way that our governments function, in the way that our judiciary functions. And I think there's so much change to be had and to be made. But I've had that sense that, you know, whatever change you make it where it matters the most to you.
Yeah.
So I moved back to Udupi after I graduated at Oxford. I graduated, I worked for a bit at the British Parliament so that I don't get the tag of being chased away from Britain.
Right.
And I moved back to India, and I sort of moved back not to a big city that's comparable to London, because I lived in London, lived that whole life where you wear designer clothes and walk to work in the metro in the morning and then come back in the evening, you know, with that fancy cup of coffee in your hand. But I chose to move back to Udupi because if anything, this experience has taught me that you can only be at peace with yourself if you do things that create impact.
Right.
My fundamental thinking changed. Now I don't want to be part of the system where I take something from 99.99 to 99.999, like I would do contribute to any institution in London or abroad. But back in my hometown, I get to take something from a 30 to a 90.
Right.
And that helps me sleep better.
Okay, great.
And
So I think we are running out of time. And thank you, Rashmi, for such
Thank
an
you.
enlightening conversation. Let's hope that a book like yours will encourage global institutions, higher education institutions, to introspect and reform their approach to inclusivity and equity.
thank you so much.
So, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, now it is your turn. Rashmi would be happy to respond to any questions that you have. Okay, we can take only one question. We don't have enough time. So could somebody get a mic there, please? Yeah.
Hi. What do you think the future holds for for Oxford and the Ivy Leagues and all these other institutions which have been pilloried, often rightly so, in the last few years for being ideological echo chambers and for creating an environment like the one you've described? Like, do you think there is hope for these institutions in terms of, sort of getting back to an environment of openness and academic freedom in the next few years? Because a lot of people, despite hearing all these things, a lot of people in this country and all over the world do want to go, and these places are still, the standard by which every other institution in the world is judged.
True.
Well, thank you for that question too. I think answer you briefly. They do have an economic interest in changing the way that they function because it's a huge cash cow for the country, if not the institution itself.
True.
The kind of money that comes from international students. So the more the whistleblowing happens, the more are they compelled to change the way that they function. Because if they don't, then they're going to lose out on the money, the prestige and everything. So where there is, I think, economic sort of incentive, people do change.
Yeah.
But I think it also creates a scope for other universities to come up. And I mean, now the challenge is everywhere. People are even questioning the way that these universities are ranked. It's almost like you hit something on the wall and then place the bullseye where the arrow lands. It's almost like that these universities have been ranked for the past couple of decades. And Oxford, on a last note, Oxford became #1 because King of England actually banned English students from leaving because Paris was was the hub. Everybody wanted to study in Paris. Nobody wanted to go to Oxford or Cambridge, and it was way down there and nobody wanted to study there. They were real bad universities. So the King of England actively barred students from leaving England for 300 years by way of a decree for that university to actually come up in the ranking. So I think as more of this history unravels, we are left to choose whether we want to go there or better our own universities. I certainly had that wake-up moment when all of this unraveled for me.
Okay, thank you, Rashmi.